So we're all here, there are no presenters, and we have like a general theme for this thing. So it seems like the theme suggests two possibilities. One is, how does Occupy demonstrate that theory can be useful? And I think that people are sort of talking in that way and maybe pointing out some points of application where that might be true, so we can prove to ourselves that theory can be useful, which doesn't seem very useful to me. The other thing that we can do is say, what are the specific questions that Occupy as a movement has raised that need further theoretical clarification if we're going to move forward? And I think just because we're here for an hour, maybe it would be more participatory for us to come together with a list of specific questions that the movement has raised up until this point that thus far don't have clear answers, and then begin workshopping ways that we can start thinking through that using the acquisitions of theory.
Within those, we can probably drill down and think about how, where are the actual points that we actually don't understand. I think this is actually, a suggestion that's worthwhile. It's like, where are things still unclear, right?
What's the role of actually physically occupying public spaces? That's certainly created an immense energy, and then I think a couple months in it was like, oh, we're spending all this time maintaining these occupations against all of these threats. What's the worth of that? And so I think we sort of saw both sides of that, and I'm really curious about that. And what's the relationship between that physical retaking of the commons and building a community in public space and all other movement building activities? How do they feed off each other?
Initially, in sort of justifying or explaining the value of physical space in terms of it kind of being the last horizon of the neoliberal paradigm. Like, this is the final frontier of things that those of us who exist within bourgeois democratic societies expect to be able to access. We expect to be able to walk in our communities. We expect to be able to congregate with whom we want and speak with them. It's written into our constitutions, et cetera, et cetera. And so tying the attempt to conquer space by privatizing it, by placing advertisements all around it, by turning it into something different where the functionality gets delimited by different authorities. That was one of the ways in which it helped people understand what the value was of space. But then theory, at a different moment, allowed us to show how we couldn't let the theory of space dictate our strategy. So we needed a strategic theory to show us or help guide us on this question of, well, if this particular tactic is currently being problematic, how can we move forward? How can we evolve from it while still recognizing the value and the sort of ontology of space and why we're pursuing that, at the same time recognizing that we need to move on for political and strategic reasons. So I think having that zone in both senses allowed people to get out of the day-to-day a little bit in order to better understand how to move forward.
An understanding or a theory that gives, at least that I apply to understandings of space, is the theory of autonomy, and that derived from one of the key philosophers of autonomy, Cornelius Castoriadis, of Socialism or Barbarie of France, and whose ideas had some influence on the student worker uprising there, 1968. And the whole idea of autonomy in this context is not autonomous space that's just taken over and it's separate from the ruling institutions per se. It's actually the self-conscious recreation of social relations and the institution within that space. And so this, to me, is some kind of signification between the use of space as a demand or a tactic versus, which is, is especially valuable, but then versus the use of space for self-management, or say if it's a university, the self-administration of curriculum and grades, and or if it's a workplace, French workers a couple years ago took over the workplace and they were demanding the bosses pay them, and they were holding all the equipment hostage and were threatening to blow up the factory, versus, say, taking over the factory and putting it towards an autonomous reorganization of that space for new division of labor and self-management.
And just on the question of space, I mean, really briefly, there was a situationist writer who wrote a book called The Revolution of Everyday Life, where he was talking about, politics being out there somewhere in this public space was, entirely problematic. Part of why we're radicals is because we want to change our daily lives, our lived realities. That might be interesting in terms of, as the encampments come down, where we actually start enacting these kinds of processes. What would happen if we started occupying our workplaces and our homes and our communities, and what might that look like if politics were in daily life rather than in some special place? Relatedly, there was a piece by a group called Do or Die called Give Up Activism, which is a critique of activism and the activist mentality, which is an awesome piece that talks about how it's very limited for a bunch of specialists in social change to go meet out there somewhere else and go do this hobby together instead of enacting, politics in our daily lives and in our lived realities. So those might be decent theoretical resources for this question.